The smell came first. Long before the screaming, before the sermons, before the sight of bodies collapsing into muddy alleys like broken puppets, the stench arrived. Acrid, greasy, and thick with rot, it clung to everything. It rolled down the cobblestone lanes like a slow, invisible fog, seeping into woolen sleeves and rough-hewn thatch roofs, soaking through the wooden shutters of peasant huts. To breathe was to taste it. And if you were poor, and almost everyone was, you had no choice but to breathe deeply. Agnes felt it the morning her neighbor's goat started howling. Goats don't howl, not unless something's wrong. The beast's eyes bulged like grapes left too long in the sun, its jaw twisted sideways, and it ran itself head first into a wall before collapsing in a heap. Old Mara, the owner of the goat, didn't even scream. She just knelt beside it, touched its fur, canned, muttered a single word, "Coming," and that was it. That was the beginning of the end of everything. Agnes was 14. Her hands were blistered from hours spent scrubbing dried blood from her father's leather apron. Her feet were cracked from trudging through slop to bring water from the communal well. She had never seen a mirror, never written her name, and had never once eaten a full loaf of bread on her own. She had never known rest, and now she would never know peace. Because something was moving through their village, something older than scripture, crueler than war, and utterly indifferent to the rank and file of peasants who lived only to be forgotten. The elders called it the death fog. The priests called it a punishment. The nobility, far away behind high walls, didn't call it anything at all, Kate. They just closed their gates and waited for the stench to pass. Life as a peasant before the plague was already a brutal ritual of scraping, scabbing, and serving. You lived by the sun and died by the cold. Your body wasn't your own. It belonged to your lord, to the taxes, to the hunger that gnawed even in sleep. Marriage was rarely love. It was survival. A good year meant fewer lice. A bad year meant burying half your siblings. Yet somehow, the plague made even that bleak reality seem like paradise. Because, at least before, the cruelty was slow. Now, itwa, sudden, arbitrary, absolute. One day a man would be plowing the field, and the next he'd be choking on his own bile, his skin blackening like scorched parchment, his tongue swollen until it burst. Children played marbles on Monday and were burning in mass graves by Friday. The town bell tolled not for prayer, but for cart calls. Bring out your dead became more common than good morning. Agnes watched as her childhood friend, Thomas, was thrown onto a wheelbarrow, still twitching. His mother clung to his leg, screaming that he was breathing, that he was still warm. But the priest barked back, better he die clean than live to spread. That was the logic now. Mercy was a liability, and soon, so was love. What made it worse was the waiting. You didn't just get sick and die. You watched it take your neighbor, then your sister, then your dog, toe. You smelled it under your nails. You tasted it in your stew. Every cough in the village was a loaded prayer. Every scratch on your arm a prophecy. You didn't bury the dead anymore. You burned them, if you could afford firewood. Most couldn't. Agnes remembered the sound the bodies made when they were dumped into the ditch behind the abbey. Not a thud, not a splash, just a wet, muffled collapse, like the earth itself was too tired to protest. There was no medicine, no salve, no healing herb, no whispered charm from the old crone by the river. Every cure was a lie. People wrapped themselves in vinegar-soaked rags, burned incense until their lungs bled, prayed until their knees cracked open. Nothing stopped it. The rats ran wild, the fleas feasted, the filth deepened, and in the middle of it all, the poor were told they were the cause. "It is your sin," cried the bishop, draped in fine linens from Italy. "Your fornication, your idleness, your gluttony, you have brought this upon us all." It didn't matter that peasants had no time to sin. There was no gluttony in starvation, no fornication when your body ached too much to move. Idleness. The idea was laughable, but truth didn't matter. Blame had to fall somewhere, and it always fell on the ones already broken. Agnes and her brother Jory took to sleeping in the root cellar, not because it was safer, but because it was darker. If they couldn't see the bodies in the street, they could pretend, just for a night, that things might return to what they were. But Jory was coughing now. At first, she told herself it was the dust, then, maybe the cold. But when she saw the swell under his armpit, black and pulsing like a crow's eye, she stopped pretending. He didn't even cry. He just asked if she would sing. She couldn't. She didn't remember the words. When he died, she sat beside him for a full day, too numb to scream, and then she walked out, holding his body in her arms, down the center of the village street. She said nothing. The other villagers turned away, not because they were cruel, but because they couldn't look anymore. They had seen too much, and they were terrified they might be next. No one offered to help bury him. No one even asked his name. That night, something in Agnes broke. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She stood outside her family's hovel, breathing in the plague-ridden air like a dare. If death wanted her, it would have to come find her. She was done hiding. And in that moment, something strange happened. She didn't die. Days passed. Then a week. She waited for the boils, the fever, the blackened limbs. But they never came. Everyone around her fell, and still she stood. Some said she was cursed. Others whispered she was blessed. A midwife claimed she was a witch. Canis didn't care. She wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever mercy had spared her, it hadn't done so out of kindness. It had made her watch. She became a collector, not of things, of stories. Each time she helped carry a body, she asked for their name. When the villagers had stopped keeping records, she began etching marks into the barn wall, one for each soul. When she ran out of wall, she used the floor. When she ran out of floor, she carved them into stones and stacked them by the well. By the end of that winter, her hands were raw, her mind hollowed out from grief. But the names lived. Somehow, that mattered, because that was the worst part of the plague. Not the death, not the decay, but the forgetting. People died alone, unwept, unnamed, like they had never mattered. Agnes wasn't a healer. She wasn't a saint. She was just a peasant girl who refused to let the world erase her people. And in a world where no one could save you, sometimes being remembered was the closest thing to salvation. But just as the village began to believe the plague might be ending, just as the snow thawed and the fires went out, a new cart rolled into the square. It was covered in red cloth, drawn by pale horses with hollow eyes, and from the back stepped a figure in a robe of midnight, face hidden behind a beaked mask. A doctor, they said, sent from the city, paid by the lords. He promised healing, promised safety, promised to cleanse what was left of the village. But Agnes saw something else in his eyes, something colder than death. Rain had soaked through the roofs again. The straw thatched above them had rotted weeks ago, and now the heavens poured freely into the single-room hut where Beatrix lay, motionless, listening to the rhythm of droplets plinking into the broken wooden bowls they had placed beneath the worst leaks. She had not moved for hours. Her mother, Alina, crouched beside her on a crude pile of rags, muttering the same prayer she'd whispered when their first child died, except this time her lips moved without sound. Words had long lost their power. This prayer was an echo, of memory, something automatic, like breathing through grief when one no longer wants to. Beatrix's breath came in small puffs, shallow and thin, like a flame trying to stay alive in a cold wind. The red swellings beneath her arms had turned black. Hugo sat at the far corner of the hut, carving a piece of wood with the same blade he'd once used to cut rope on the farm. He had not looked at his daughter since sunrise. He could not. Looking at her meant acknowledging the truth. That Beatrix, the girl who had once run through the barley fields barefoot and wild, was not coming back. The child was gone. What remained on the pallet was only a shell. Outside, the village had changed. There were no songs, no drunkards, no sound of children. The dogs that roamed the lanes no longer barked. They sniffed at bodies and fled from the smell. The forge had gone cold. The baker had shut his doors. After his son fell face first into a pile of dough and never got back up. Chickens wandered freely into houses where no feet stirred. Doors were left open, sometimes by design, sometimes by the last person too weak to shut them. Alina had always been strong. She had outlived childbirth thrice. She had delivered not just her own, but half the village's young with those blood-stained hands. She had known suffering, but the kind of suffering that came with the Black Death was not like famine or childbirth. It didn't whisper, it screamed. It rotted a child from the inside out while they were still awake to feel it. It took wives and left husbands mad. It buried entire families while the last brother was still digging graves. There was no preparing for this, and Alina knew she had no fight left. Not after Tomas, her youngest, coughed blood into her face and died within a day. Not after her sister hung herself from the church beam, because she thought the devil had entered her lungs. The priest had stopped coming weeks ago. They said he'd fled to the abbey miles away, where the walls were thick, and the brothers boiled wine before drinking it. They thought the heat would kill the miasma. Alina doubted it. God had stopped listening. The chapel had become a crypt. Beatrix moaned softly. A shiver passed through her frail body. Alina wiped her daughter's brow with a rag soaked in cold water. It smelled faintly of ash. There was no clean linen anymore, only scraps torn from the clothes of the dead. The well had dried up 3 days earlier. They'd been boiling rainwater since a knock came at the door. Hugo looked up sharply. They had not heard a knock in a fortnight. No one visited anymore. He rose slowly, the knife still in hand, and opened the creaking door. It was Yannick, the village's former thatcher, though he hardly looked like the man they remembered. Tay. His beard was tangled with what might have been vomit or soup. His eyes were red and glassy. He wore a sackcloth tunic that hung from his frame like it belonged to someone twice his size. But it was the thing he held that made Hugo step back. Mask. Long-nosed, black leather. The kind the plague doctors wore in the city. I found it in a cart, Yannick rasped. Q. Outside the monastery. Alina stood now, pulling her shawl tight. Why would you bring that here? Yannick's smile was cracked. They say it protects you. If you stuff the nose with herbs, sage, lavender, even onions. Hugo looked past him. Who else is left? Yannick scratched the edge of his mask. Old Greta is dead. Her cows went first, then her. He swallowed. The blacksmith's girl still breathes, I think. But her eyes don't close anymore. Alina stared at the mask. It was cracked near the eye socket, and the leather was warped by heat, maybe from a fire. But it was the only thing that looked remotely clean. Yannick raised the mask higher. If you want it, it's yours. I've already kissed death's mouth. Tet. He pulled down his collar. Black boils lined his neck like ink spots. I'll not make it through the week. He placed the mask at the doorstep and walked away, singing softly under his breath. The tune was a nursery rhyme one children once sang while skipping rope. The kind Beatrix had loved. Alina stepped outside and picked up the mask. It smelled of vinegar and something fouler. She turned it over in her hands, then looked at Hugo. Boil it, she said. That night, they placed it beside Beatrix's bed, half out of hope, half in despair. And when Alina slipped it over her face the next morning to go fetch firewood, she imagined herself armored, not against disease, but against the creeping numbness that came with watching one's family fade. In the weeks that followed, Beatrix lingered. She did not die. But she did not return either. She moaned. She muttered names. She cried out for Tomas, even though he'd been buried in the ditch near the broken wall. Alina kept watch, and Hugo, too, though he grew quieter each day, like the man within him was slowly walking away. The sky never cleared. The fog rolled in each morning, thick and yellow-tinged ashes from burning homes, they said, or from the fields set alight in desperation to cleanse the earth. Crops had been left unharvested. The mice were thriving. One evening, a strange figure came riding in from the east. No one saw his face, only the broad hat, the black coat, and the mask. Not the crude one Yannick had scavenged, but a real one, lacquered and gleaming. He rode past the rotting carts, past the bodies by the roadside, past the chapel and the inn with its doors hanging wide. He stopped at Beatrix's house. He did not knock. Alina stepped out before he reached the door. You're too late, she said. He didn't speak. We've lost everything. Still, he said nothing. You doctors always come when there's no one left to save. Then, finally, his voice, muffled through the beak, soft as dust. She is not lost, she is between. Alina shook her head. She's been between for a month. He nodded slowly. Then she has chosen. He stepped past her, into the house. She followed, numb. He knelt by Beatrix's side, opened a satchel, and withdrew a vial of black liquid. He whispered something in a language Alina did not recognize. Then he poured a single drop into Beatrix's mouth. The girl's eyes opened. She blinked. Alina, she said. Just once. Then she slept. But her breathing, it was steady. The man stood, turned to Hugo, and held out the vial. No one can take this but the willing, he said. She was willing. What is it? Hugo asked. A gift from the East, he replied, but not without price. Hugo stared at the black glass. Will she live? Perhaps. But she will not be the same. The man turned. None of us, Gar. He left without another word. That night, Alina sat beside her daughter, weeping. Not from grief, from the terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, life had found them again. Outside, the rain had stopped. The village was quiet. But deep beneath the floorboards, where rats made nests of straw and bone, something stirred. Something ancient. Something waiting and far off, where the mountains touched the edge of the world. Another rider watched the stars and waited for the next place to fall. The days had no names now. Time was measured not in hours or dates, but in breaths, in coughs, in how many more bodies were carted past the crooked fence post at the end of the lane. Hugo had stopped counting. So had Alina. There was no use in keeping track when no one would ever ask again. The calendars were useless, rotting parchment on the church walls, and the sun itself seemed to have abandoned its duties. Some days never brightened at all. A gray mist hung over the thatched rooftops like a wool shroud, pulled over the face of the earth, and even the roosters no longer crowed. They, too, had gone silent or starved. Beatrix remained alive, somehow, against every rule of nature, every law the sickness had written in its script of blood and bile. She did not die. She slept. For days at a time, she drifted between dreaming, cut, and fevered muttering, her body thinner now than a wisp of smoke, but her skin no longer festered. The boils had stopped spreading. The stench had lessened. Her breath, though faint, came steady, like the ticking of a clock deep inside a cave. But Beatrix was not the same. The first time she awoke fully, she did not recognize her mother. She screamed when Alina leaned in, a scream so piercing and primal that the birds in the trees took flight as one. Her voice, unused and dry, cracked with the sound of an animal cornered. Her eyes darted around the room like those of a feral cat, and she clawed at her bedding, tearing at the patched linens as cuff if they were chains. Hugo had to hold her down while Alina wept, repeating over and over, "It's us, it's Mama, it's Papa, you're safe." But Beatrix wasn't listening. She was somewhere else. The following night, she spoke in languages no one in the village had ever heard. Harsh, guttural syllables, not Latin, not German, not French. Just strange sounds that didn't belong to this place, sounds that felt older than the mountains themselves. The mask, the black glass vial, the rider in the coat, all of it circled Elena's mind like smoke in a locked room. Something had been given to Beatrix, something that saved her body but took something else. Soul. Her soul. Her memories, or worse, replaced them. Alina was afraid to ask, still life clung stubbornly to their doorstep. A few others returned from hiding, families who had fled into the woods when the sickness crept into town. They emerged, gaunt, hollow-eyed, like ghosts wearing the skins of those they once were. Among them was young Lucas, once a stable boy, now a man aged by horror. His father had died from the plague in the forest, and his mother had drowned herself in a creek. When his sister began to cough, he had buried them alone beneath pine needles and frozen soil. When he walked back into the village, he walked like someone who knew too much about silence. He was the first to notice that Beatrix no longer cast a shadow at dawn. "It's not right," he whispered to Alina, as they stood outside the hut. One morning, their feet crunching the brittle frost. I watched her walk past the well. The sun was behind her, clear as a bell. But there was nothing on the ground, like she wasn't there. Alina didn't speak. She merely tightened her grip on the shawl around her shoulders. Lucas hesitated, then added, "She's not like us anymore." He was right, of course. Beatrix no longer spoke at all during the day, but at night she wandered. They would find her at strange hours, standing in corners, staring at cracks in the wall, whispering to them. Sometimes she would leave the house altogether and walk barefoot to the grave ditch, standing at its edge as if listening for voices beneath the earth. Her skin was pale and waxy, and her eyes no longer blinked with the rhythm of sleep. Hugo had started keeping a knife beneath the hay mattress. But what terrified Alina more than Beatrix's wandering was that she wasn't the only one. Across the village, children had begun waking up different. Those who had survived the plague, the rare few, were not like they were before. Little Mara, who had once been mute since birth, now spoke fluently, in full sentences, and asked questions about things she couldn't possibly know. The names of saints from centuries ago, or what lay buried beneath the abbey crypt. Young Peter, who had nearly drowned in a fever, now drew perfect circles in the mud, muttering mathematical equations he had never learned. And old Greta's grandson, who had barely learned to write his name, now etched runes into stone with his fingernails. Runes that glowed faintly at dusk. It was as though whatever had come with the plague had not merely killed, it had changed the ones it spared. Alina brought her fears to Hugo one night. Sitting beside the hearth as a dying fire smoldered between them. "What if it wasn't death we brought into our home?" she said, her voice shaking. "What if it was something worse?" Hugo didn't answer. He was watching Beatrix through the cracks in the wooden door. She stood outside again, barefoot in the cold, her breath visible, not shivering. Her face was calm. Too calm. Sky, head tilted, as if waiting for a reply. "I don't think she's ours anymore," he said finally. That night, Alina had a dream. She was back in the chapel, though the walls were covered in vines. The pews were empty. The crucifix was gone, replaced by a symbol she didn't recognize, a twisted spiral that pulsed with light. And Beatrix stood at the altar, robed in black, her face expressionless. Around her were children, all of them marked, each with glowing veins beneath their skin, eyes like mirrors, mouths that did not move even as they spoke. "We are not the end," they said in one voice. "We are the beginning." Alina woke, screaming. The fire had gone out. She found Hugo already sitting upright, knife in hand. He had heard something, voices in the trees. Cheat. He swore they were chanting by dawn. Lucas had gathered the other survivors. There were only 15 of them now, and they were all afraid. A council was held in the old square, though there were no elders left. Only survivors, each with their own nightmares, their own stories. One woman had watched her daughter walk into a frozen lake and never come back. Another had heard her baby speak to her in the voice of her dead husband. All of them agreed something had been unleashed with the plague. Something older than disease. Something watching. They called it the second birth. It was decided that the children, the ones changed, would be isolated, not harmed, just kept apart, until they knew what this was. Alina refused. She is my daughter, she said. She lived. I won't put her in a cage. But they weren't asking. They came for Beatrix that evening. Hugo stood in the doorway with his knife. Lucas held a pitchfork. Others carried ropes, torches, desperate eyes. She hasn't harmed anyone, Alina pleaded. She's just lost. She's not alone, Lucas replied. And she's not lost. She's leading them. Beatrix appeared behind them then, silent. She walked forward, calm as ever, placing a hand on her father's arm. He dropped the knife, just dropped it, as if his bones had forgotten how to hold anything. She kissed her mother's cheek, then turned to the crowd and walked forward without fear. They followed her to the old chapel. It was hollow now, its roof partially caved, but the altar still stood. Beatrix climbed onto it, turned and looked at them all, then she spoke. Her first true words since the sickness left her. You buried your dead and forgot to close the door, she said. But they didn't leave, they just changed. Silence. Then she smiled. It's our turn now. The chapel shook. The earth trembled, and beneath their feet, something ancient began to stir. Not bones, not rot, but something deeper. Memory, hunger, the echo of all those who died unjustly. Screaming through time for a second chance, the mist returned, curling in like fingers, and as the villagers turned to flee, they found themselves trapped, not by walls, but by choice. You could not unsee what had been seen. You could not go back to the world. Before the plague, Beatrix had been the first, but she would not be the last. There were no more church bells, no morning chimes, no soft tolling to mark the hours of prayer or meals or rest. Time had disintegrated into something less than linear, a strange blur of gray hours and uncertain midnights. For the peasants who remained in the valley, life, shifts, was no longer a rhythm of harvests and festivals. It had become a slow erosion, a scraping of days against the inside of their minds. Even those who had survived the Black Plague by luck, isolation, or sheer stubbornness now faced something worse, the truth that survival did not equal peace. In the aftermath of Beatrix's march into the crumbling chapel, the village changed, not violently, not all at once, but slowly, subtly, the kind of shift that creeps under your doorframe and doesn't knock. The children who had been taken away, the ones marked by the so-called second birth, were kept in a makeshift space Pays, the abandoned granary, once used to store barley and rye. Now, Its stone walls echoed with quiet murmurs and strange laughter. The villagers had tried to make it humane, tried to bring bread and blankets and warmth, but none of the children seemed cold. None of them ate. They simply sat, staring, watching, waiting. Elena visited Beatrix. Every morning, she sat on the other side of the iron-barred window, speaking softly, bringing stories from her own childhood, humming lullabies. Beatrix used to fall asleep too, but her daughter never replied, never blinked. She simply tilted her head, as if recording every word, every vibration in the air, storing them somewhere deeper than memory. Her skin had gone pale, almost translucent, as though whatever thread bound her to flesh was wearing thin dot. Lucas watched Alina from afar now. He did not speak unless spoken to, and even then his words were clipped, suspicious. He had taken it upon himself to organize nightly patrols, not against wolves or raiders, but against the air, the feeling that things were wrong. The fields grew crooked. The sheep bleated in panic every time the wind changed, and 2 weeks after the containment of the children, a villager named Agnes was found dead in her home, eyes wide, no wound on her body, her mouth frozen in a scream. The only clue was a circle, drawn in ash on her doorstep, and small barefoot prints, leading away from it. The village elders, or what passed for them now, gathered in secret. Hugo attended in Elena's place. She refused to join their meetings anymore. She'd said everything she needed to say the day they took Beatrix away. Now her silence was sharper than any words she might have spoken. They debated exile, burning the granary, drowning the children in the marsh. Horrors spoken aloud like common sense, but none had the strength to do it. The truth was, they were afraid, not just of what might happen if they acted, but of what might happen if they didn't. For every day the children remained. Something in the village decayed. The bread never rose correctly anymore. Milk spoiled within hours of being drawn. Dogs barked at shadows, then went missing. And one morning, the sky turned red for just a moment at sunrise. It blinked like an eye. Then it returned to gray. Some began to whisper, curse. Others said it was punishment, not from God, but from something older, something forgotten by the priests but remembered by the bones in the earth. The plague hadn't just brought death, it had peeled back a layer of the world, and something, eels, had crawled through. Beatrix began speaking again, only at night, only in fragments. The farmer who lived closest to the granary claimed he heard her through the stone, reciting the names of the dead, not just the recent ones, names from the village ledger no one had read in years, names of those who died before the sickness, names no child should know. Another said he heard her chanting to something beneath the ground, as if there were ears listening in the soil. When Alina heard these rumors, she did not flinch. She simply pressed her palm against the iron bars and whispered, I know you're still in there, and I'm not leaving. Then, one night, the granary doors stood open. No one heard them unlock. No one broke them down. They were simply open, silent, and the children were gone. The village erupted into panic. Every home locked its doors. Torches were lit, animals brought inside, families huddled in corners, clutching whatever relics or talismans they had left. Hugo ran to the church bell, what was left of it, and rang it for the first time in weeks. The sound brittle and hollow. They searched the entire village. Every well, every root cellar, every coop. Nothing, no tracks, no sign, just empty silence. Until a scream came from the hills. It was old Mikkel, the beekeeper. He had climbed the ridge to check on his hives and found them all melted. Not destroyed. Melted, like wax. But colder. Beside the ruined hives were carvings. In the trees, the spiral. That same mark from Elena's dream. From the chapel, it was spreading now. Carved into bark, scratched into stone, drawn in soot on windows. And still, no one knew what it meant. The following evening, the children returned. They walked into the village in single file. Barefoot, not a trace of dirt on their feet. Their eyes glowed faintly, not like fire, but like reflections. Each one held a stone, the same kind of smooth, flat river stones, used to weigh down burial shrouds. They dropped them at the foot of the chapel. Then they spoke. All together, we have opened the gate, and vanished into the fog. That night, people began to die again. But this time, there were no boils, no coughing, no fevers, just silence. The kind of silence that swallows you. People were found sitting upright in their beds, eyes open, hearts. Death stopped. Others disappeared entirely, their homes left undisturbed, as if they had simply walked out of existence. The spiral was everywhere now, drawn in chalk, ash, blood, etched into dreams. Lucas and Hugo made one final decision. They would burn the chapel, salt the ground, do what the old stories said. The stories no one wanted to believe. Alina begged them not to. She's still my daughter, she said. She can still come back. But even she felt the pull. She had seen Beatrix standing in the trees again. Not walking, standing just watching the house from a distance. Not blinking, not moving, just being. And in her hand was a second stone, a smooth one. Just the right size to press against your tongue as they wrapped you in linen. The chapel burned. Flames danced high into the sky. Smoke curling in shapes that twisted and screamed. But no children came to stop them, no spirits. Just the fire. And a sound. Low, distant. A heartbeat, not human, not animal. The land pulsed. The villagers knew then. It wasn't the children. It never was. The plague had been a messenger. The children were the door. And now, the thing that had waited was awake. In the weeks that followed, the fog never lifted. The sun rose dimmer each day. Crops withered even in rain. And beneath the fields, the earth began to hum. Some said it was a warning. Others said it was a lullaby. Beatrix appeared one final time at the well in the square. Her skin was no longer pale, it was luminous. Her hair floated in the still air as if underwater. She spoke to Alina, who ran to her without fear. "You don't need to be afraid anymore," Beatrix whispered. "It doesn't hurt. It's just different." Alina cradled her, cried into her shoulder. And then Beatrix vanished. Not walked away. Vanished. The fog swallowed her, and that was the last time anyone in the village saw one of the second-born. Years passed. New crops grew strangely fast. The land became fertile, again, but no new children were born. The village remained hollow and strange, populated by survivors with shadows too long and dreams too vivid. No one spoke of the plague anymore. They said the sickness was over. But they didn't say cured, they said it had moved on. The spiral never left green. It remained in the grain of the wood, in the shape of the rivers, in the eyes of the crows, and every so often, at the edge of the mist, a barefoot child could be seen watching from the tree line, smiling. The year stretched on in a cold hush that blanketed the village like a secret no one dared speak. Not even the birds returned in spring. The soil, once rich with the smell of life and decay, now yielded nothing but silence. Trees did not bud. Fields did not grow. And the sky, eternally gray, hung low over the rooftops as if waiting for something, a reckoning, a surrender, or perhaps a final breath. But no one in the village knew what that final breath would mean anymore. By then, only a handful of peasants, remained. The rest had either succumbed to the plague, vanished into the mist, or walked beyond the boundaries of their world, chasing the hum of something unknown. Those who stayed behind, Lucas, Hugo, Alina, and a few others, clung not to hope, but to habit. They woke each morning, lit their hearths, fetched water, and said nothing. Their lives continued not out of faith or purpose, but because stopping meant confronting the unraveling truth that this wasn't life at all anymore. It was the memory of life, looping softly, quietly, like wind through empty barns. Lucas had started walking, not to go anywhere, just to move. From one side of the village to the other, from the crumbled watchtower to the granary door. He watched the frost patterns along the wooden beams, noted how the spiral kept appearing in the ice, in the bark, in the clouds. It wasn't paranoia. They were real. The spiral had become part of the land, etched into the village like veins under skin. One morning, he saw it carved into the sole of his own foot. He'd stepped on something in the night, perhaps. But there was no wound, no pain. Just the smooth, cold shape, like a brand left by air itself. He didn't tell anyone. Who would he tell? Hugo had long since stopped asking questions. His greys no longer looked outward. They gazed into the fireplace, as if it held answers to things no fire should know. Alina, on the other hand, had begun speaking again, but not to the others. She whispered to the trees, to the fog, to her daughter, Beatrix, who had disappeared months before into the mist. Alina left pieces of bread at her doorstep, tiny carved toys on the windowsill, and one night, she lit every candle she owned and lined the path to the forest's edge with them. In the morning, the candles were gone. But a spiral had been traced in ash across her threshold. Some villagers believed they were caught in a punishment, others, a dream. But by the 5th month of fog and silence, a new idea had taken root. One darker, deeper, and more unsettling. What if the plague hadn't killed them? What if it had peeled something open? There had been rumors in the early days, when the sickness first spread across the kingdoms, that the Black Death wasn't just a disease. That it was a thinning of the veil between worlds. That as the human body weakened, other things came closer. Things that didn't breathe air. Things that didn't need permission to enter. Monks had spoken of shadows standing in doorways long after the dead were buried, of voices calling from wells, of children drawing shapes they'd never been taught, shapes like the spiral. And here, in this forgotten village, nestled between forest and hill, those shapes had stayed. Cut. One morning, Lucas found Alina standing in the square, motionless, her eyes fixed on the well. The cover had blown off in the night. Fog rose from it, like smoke from a deep fire. I heard her voice, she said softly, not looking at him. Beatrix. She said she wasn't cold. Lucas said nothing. She said there's room for more, Alina added. She said there's something down there, waiting. Lucas stepped closer. The fog from the well did not rise naturally. It spiraled, spinning upward in slow, elegant curves. He could see no bottom, no water, only that curling mist. A hum, faint but unmistakable, tickled the edge of his hearing. Don't look too long, Alina whispered. It pulls. That night, Lucas dreamt of the granary. Not as it was now empty and gray, but full, lit, warm. A golden light flickered inside, and within it stood every villager he had lost. Children laughed. Women sang. Old men nodded by the fire. No one looked at him. No one noticed he was there, until one figure turned. Beatrix. She walked toward him slowly, her face older, eyes wider, her expression calm, not smiling, not sad, just aware. You haven't chosen yet, she said. Chosen what? Lucas cast. To remain, she replied, or to return. Return to what? She didn't answer. Instead, she placed a hand over his heart and whispered something in a language he didn't know, but understood. A spiral bloomed on the floor, beneath them, and the dream collapsed into blackness. He awoke gasping, drenched in sweat. The room around him shimmered, as if the air itself was stretching thin. That day, Lucas did not walk the village. He sat by his fire and carved symbols into the wood of his door. Not prayers. Not runes. Spirals. That evening, the fog deepened. The granary door creaked open without wind, and for the first time in weeks, someone laughed. It was a child's laugh, but there were no children left. Hugo stood from his bench and looked out the window. Hands trembled. I saw them, he whispered, in the trees. Watching who? Lucas asked. They look like us, Hugo said, but their eyes are wrong. That night, Lucas placed a knife beneath his pillow. It didn't help, because then, the next morning, he awoke, not in his bed, but at the edge of the forest, his feet bare, his clothes damp with dew. The spiral had been traced in frost all around him, like a net or a map. When he returned, Hugo was gone. Alina was already sitting in the square. He walked into the granary last night, she said softly, and didn't come back out. You saw him. I heard the door open. I didn't stop him. Lucas stared at the granary. The light inside flickered, faint golden, familiar. Do you think it's death? He asked. Alina shook her head. Worse. I think it's choice. That night, Lucas built a fire in front of the granary. He sat beside it, eyes fixed on the door, the spirals carved into its frame. They pulsed faintly with some inner glow, a heartbeat. He could almost match with his own. Alina joined him after midnight. They didn't speak. They watched, and sometime before dawn, they heard Beatrix humming. For the first time in weeks, Lucas cooed couldn't tell whether he was awake or dreaming. The fog had thickened to the point where the line between night and day no longer mattered. Time, once marked by church bells or rooster cries, had become something else entirely. In the village, silence no longer felt empty, it was loaded, breathing, sentient. Every quiet corner, every soft footstep across muddy ground, seemed to carry weight, as if unseen eyes tracked each movement. Alina had not spoken since the night they heard Beatrix humming. She sat at her window, staring into the distance where the trees began. Sometimes she moved her lips as if in prayer, but no sound emerged. Lucas tried speaking to her. He asked her if she had slept, if she had eaten. No reply, just that vacant gaze, and an occasional blink, as though she was no longer entirely present. As though part of her had already gone where Hugo had gone, into the granary. The granary stood still, a dark sentinel at the heart of the village. No one dared approach it now, not even Lucas. He would wake in the night to find the door ajar. The soft flicker of candlelight within, and a low sound like wind churning water. But the air would be dead still. The trees didn't rustle. The wind had stopped entirely. What stirred inside the granary wasn't nature. Then the voices began. It started with Lucas hearing his mother's voice. She had died in the first wave of the plague. Quaking one night, as he sat alone beside the dying embers of his fire. He heard her calling his name, softly, gently, like when she would wake him as a boy. He rose instinctively and stepped outside. The village was cloaked in a kind of stillness that made his chest ache. And again, the voice came drifting across the rooftops from the granary. Lucas, come home. Koku. He knew it wasn't her. He knew it couldn't be. But something deep inside him, old and childlike, longed to believe. That longing was the most dangerous thing of all. By the third night, more villagers reported similar voices, people they had lost, whispering in the night, calling them to return, asking them to choose. There was that word again, choose, as if some unspoken contract was waiting to be signed. Not with ink, but with surrender. Old Marta, the midwife who had outlived even her grandchildren, walked into the granary just before dawn. Lucas watched, Gergo, unable to stop her. She smiled at him as she passed, and for a moment he thought she looked younger, or rather, like someone wearing Marta's face. Steps were graceful, too graceful for her age, and her eyes. Her eyes held a kind of peace that terrified him more than madness. She never came back. Lucas began writing again, scratching words into bark, charcoal across the walls, even using bits of bone to inscribe symbols into stone. He was trying to understand. If he could just unravel the meaning of the spiral, maybe he could find a way out. Not just for himself, but for Alina, for the village, for whatever still lingered of the old world. But the spiral was older than language. It wasn't a word. It was a direction, a turning inward, an invitation to descend. One night, Lucas lit a torch and walked to the well. The spiral mist was thicker now, humming with strange life. He peered inside. For a brief, impossible moment, he saw something below, not water, not rock, but a stairway, spiral-shaped, leading down into the darkness. As he stared, the steps shimmered and vanished. as if pulled back into whatever reality he had glimpsed. He staggered back and nearly dropped the torch. The ground beneath his feet was warm, and for the first time in his life, he felt the earth breathe. It exhaled, and the breath smelled like salt and rot and fire all at once. The village was no longer a village. It had become a waiting room, a place between realms, where the rules of time and death and logic had been suspended. Those who had remained, Lucas, Alina, a few others, weren't survivors. They were witnesses. And each day, one by one, they disappeared. Sometimes into the granary, sometimes into the woods. Sometimes they simply ceased to be. Alina broke her silence on the 7th day after Marta vanished. "We're not supposed to understand," she said suddenly. Lucas turned. Startled, it was the first time she had spoken in days. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "What do you mean?" "They're not offering salvation," she said. "They're offering forgetting." He sat beside her, unsure what to say. "All our pain," she continued, "our grief, our hunger, it feeds them. But once we've been drained enough, they invite us to surrender it, not heal it, just give it away. To what end? To become like them, hollow, silent, no sorrow, but no joy, no memory." He watched her carefully. "Is that what you want?" "I wanted to see my daughter again," she said, "but not like this." Outside, the granary door creaked again. Later that night, Lucas had a second dream. He stood on the spiral staircase, descending endlessly. With each step, he shed something, first his fear, then his name, then his face. At the bottom, there was no door, no room, just a mirror. He looked into it and saw nothing. A blank shape, roughly human, wrapped in fog. And the voice, not his mother this time, but something ancient, whispered, "Choose." He awoke in tears. The village had changed. The fog was thinner now, not because it was clearing, but because it had gotten inside the homes, inside the skin. It clung to breath and voice and memory. Lucas found himself forgetting the names of those he had buried. Even faces blurred. One morning, he caught Alina whispering to something in the hearth. It wasn't lit, yet she sat before it, as though in prayer. When he asked her what she was doing, she said, "I'm practicing silence, dead." That evening, she was gone, not through the granary, not into the woods. She simply wasn't there anymore. Her home was undisturbed. Her shoes remained at the door, but no trace of her presence lingered. It was as if she had never existed. Lucas screamed for the first time in months. It echoed through the village, but no one came. He spent that night with his back to the wall, knife in hand, breath shallow. The voices came again. Not just one, dozens, maybe hundreds. All calling his name, all asking him to choose. He wept and screamed and pressed his hands over his ears. But they weren't outside. They were inside him now. By dawn he was no longer sure what was real. He went to the church, hoping for sanctuary. It was abandoned. Dust filled the air like ash. The crucifix had cracked in half, lying on the altar, and beneath it, carved in the stone floor, was the spiral. He knelt, not to pray, but because his legs had given out, and there, in the silence, he understood. The Black Death hadn't just killed bodies, it had broken a seal. The plague had been a gate, and the spirals were paths, not into death, but into forgetting, into a realm where sorrow no longer existed because memory did not, where those who had lost everything could finally lose themselves to. Lucas had a choice. Stay with his grief, his memories, his pain, or go into the granary, into the well, into the spiral, and forget. He walked the village one last time. The fog no longer seemed hostile, just empty, like the air after a scream. He traced the names of the dead into the mud with his finger. He touched the wood of each home. He whispered goodbye to the earth, and then he stepped into the granary inside. It was warm. Golden light flickered. Shadows danced. Kayak, and far ahead, deeper inside, someone sang. He followed the voice. The door creaked shut behind him, and the village, at last, was silent. The first thing Lucas noticed was the warmth. It wasn't the comforting warmth of sunlight or hearthfire. It was the kind of heat that clung to the skin, thick and humid, like the inside of a sealed room where something had been burning too long. The air inside the granary shimmered faintly, not from fire, but from something deeper, more ancient. The spiral wasn't just a symbol. Here it was alive. It ran along the floorboards in darkened grain dust, pulsed along the beams, carved its way into the very structure. Lucas stepped forward slowly, as though each footfall might tip the balance of some invisible scale. The singing stopped. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with presence, like a deep breath taken by something watching him. Cass. Lucas hesitated, knife still gripped tightly in one hand. But what would a blade do against a dream, against the unraveling of memory? The walls began to narrow as he moved deeper, the ceiling dipping lower, the air thickening. The granary wasn't built this way, he was certain. It was warping, changing shape with every step, folding in on itself like the spiral it had always hidden. At the end of the corridor, a curtain of grain sacks formed a sort of veil. Lucas reached out and pushed through. He emerged into a chamber that could not have existed within the building's modest walls. It was vast, circular, dome-like, as if carved from a great stone beneath the earth. Candles floated mid-air, their flames steady despite the heaviness of the air. And in the center of the room stood a woman, Beatrix. She was facing away from him, her long hair untouched by dust or decay. Her voice returned, soft and melodic, humming that same tune, but when she turned, it was not Beatrix, not entirely. Her face bore the same features, but they were too smooth, too symmetrical. Her eyes were darker than they should have been, pools of ink without reflection. "Lucas," she said gently, "you came." He froze. His mind wanted to recoil, to scream, to deny what he was seeing. But something in his chest relaxed at the sound of her voice. He had missed her, missed the warmth she once brought to the plague-blackened world. But he knew, deep down, this was not her. It was an echo, a lure. "Where are the others?" he asked, voice low. Beatrix smiled. "Here, with us, at peace." "What did you do to them?" "We freed them," she said, "from suffering, from hunger, from memory." She gestured around her, and suddenly the walls shimmered again, revealing figures in the shadows. Faces he recognized: Marta, Hugo, the smith's boy, the twins from the far hut, all standing motionless, serene, gazing at something unseen. They're not dead, Lucas whispered. No, Beatrix said, duh. They chose to forget. Lucas's grip on the knife tightened. And if I don't choose? She stepped closer. You will, eventually. It's what you came here for. You've lost everything, haven't you, Alina? Your mother, your village. What's left to hold on to? He lowered the knife slightly, heart pounding. Myself. She tilted her head. There is no self without memory, Lucas. Just the pain of clinging. The ground trembled softly, like a heartbeat beneath his feet. The spiral beneath their feet lit up with faint golden light, pulsating slowly. It was drawing him in. He took a step back. Beatrix's face flickered just for a second. A shadow passed across her features, something less human, more old. Lucas blinked, and the image was restored. But now he was certain. This was no place of rest. This was a trap. A beautifully crafted lie offered to the broken and grieving. The ultimate mercy, to forget. But he didn't want mercy. He wanted truth. I'm leaving, he said. Beatrix's smile faded. There is nowhere else. I'll take the pain, he said. I'll take the hunger, the emptiness, the memories. That's all I have. She reached for him, not with violence, but with heartbreaking tenderness. You'll be back. He turned and ran. The corridor twisted behind him, but he pushed forward, not caring if he screamed. He burst through the sack curtain, stumbled down the warped hallway, and out into the cold village night. He collapsed outside the granary, gasping. The fog was clearing. Not all at once, but something had shifted. The mist no longer choked. The stars were visible. For the first time in what felt like years, Lucas saw the sky. The next days passed in a kind of haze. He slept little, ate even less, but the spiral lost its power. The voices faded. No more footsteps in the night. The granary door stayed closed. He wandered the village alone. Broken fences, empty beds, toys scattered in dirt. Yet something in him felt grounded now, tethered by the choice he had made. One morning, he found a child, a boy barely 6 hiding beneath a cart, wrapped in an old cloak. The boy was terrified at first, but Lucas offered him bread and said nothing, just sat beside him. The boy's name was Jan Dot. Over the next weeks, more came, survivors from other villages, starving, wounded, wide-eyed. Lucas opened the church to them, repaired what he could, spoke little, but offered what mattered: warmth, bread, a place to rest. The plague had burned itself out in most parts, but its memory remained. The grief, the losses, the scars. Lucas didn't forget. He carried it with him, quietly. And sometimes, in dreams, he saw the spiral again, whispering. But he never answered. He told stories to the children. Stories of the stars, of old kings, of beasts that were not evil, just lost. Stories that made them laugh, cry, imagine, and slowly. The village breathed again. Years later, travelers would speak of a place that had once been swallowed by death, now filled, girt, with gardens and laughter. They would hear of a man with tired eyes and quiet wisdom who had stayed when others vanished. They never saw the Granary. It had been burned. Finally, on a cold winter night, Lucas stood alone and watched the flames rise. He didn't cry when cast. Why? He only said, "So no one forgets." Because forgetting wasn't peace, it was surrender. And Lucas had chosen to remember. The frost came early that year. It crept in beneath the doorways and turned the wells to glass by morning. Lucas felt it in his bones, even before the villagers began complaining of stiff fingers and cracking skin. But unlike the cold of years past, the cold that had crept in alongside death, trailing disease and whispers, this chill felt different. It was just weather. No sickness, no dying cows in the fields, no mysterious dreams haunting the night. The spiral, now ash beneath what had once been the granary, no longer called out to him or anyone else. And yet, Lucas couldn't bring himself to feel completely at ease. He had taken to walking the village perimeter each dawn, a habit formed during the darkest days of the plague, when he feared what might crawl into their world under the veil of mist. Now it was more about reassurance. For him, and for the dozen or so survivors who looked to him with that same quiet hope he never wanted to acknowledge. He didn't like being a symbol. Symbols cracked under pressure. He had been just a farmer. Once, then a mourner, then something like a prophetand. Now they called him steadfast. He hated it. It was during one of these pre-dawn walks that Lucas noticed footprints by the edge of the old mill, fresh ones, too large to be Jan's or the other children's. They didn't match the soles of any villager's boots either. Lucas crouched beside them, watching how the toes pointed slightly outward, and how the stride length spoke of a man who had been running, fleeing. As he rose, he heard the unmistakable crack of twigs in the trees just beyond the village. Someone was out there, watching. When he returned to the church that morning, he found Jan already awake, stoking the fire. The boy had grown taller, leaner. His hair had darkened over the years, and his eyes, once watery and frightened, now held glint of curiosity that reminded Lucas too much of Beatrix. Lucas handed him a chunk of hard bread and told him nothing of the prince. No need to scare the boy until there was a real reason. But something stirred in the pit of Lucas's gut that day. A memory, a warning. The feeling he used to get when the wind turned and the world shifted just slightly. As if someone had moved a piece on a game board far too big for mortals to understand. And as night fell, he sat by the church doors, blade in hand, not to use, just to remember it was there. It wasn't until 3 nights later that they found the man. He'd collapsed near the old boundary stones at the forest's edge, face down, in the frozen mud. Lucas, Jan, and 2 others carried him to the schoolhouse, the only place with spare blankets and enough space to lay someone out. The man was burned along his arms and chest, not from fire, from something else, as if he'd touched boiling metal, but in a pattern. Lucas recognized it immediately. The spiral. It had returned. The man's fever ran high, his lips cracked with thirst. When Lucas pressed a damp cloth to his forehead, the man jerked violently, whispering in a tongue that was part Latin, part madness. "They're coming," he hissed. "They followed me. I thought I left it behind." "Left what?" Tokus asked, low and steady. The man's eyes fluttered. "The memory, the seed. It doesn't die. It just burrows deeper." That night, Lucas sat alone by the man's side, watching the rise and fall of his shallow chest. The others wanted to send him back into the forest, feared he'd brought a new plague, some mutation of the old sickness. But Lucas recognized the signs not of illness, but of contact. The man had encountered the spiral, just as Lucas once had, and it had marked him. The next morning the man was gone, not dead, gone. The blankets lay crumpled on the floor. No sign of struggle, no blood. Just the faint smell of mildew and smoke, and a fresh spiral scorched into the floorboards, faint as breath. Panic returned to the village like a long-lost relative. Doors were barred. Fires burned higher. Mothers kept children close. Lucas knew what came next, not disease, but fear. And fear would kill faster than any fever. Over the following days, Lucas combed the forest edges, retraced the man's steps, marked trees with bits of cloth, and set traps not for beasts, but to keep people from wandering too far. He saw shadows in the trees sometimes, heard whispers when he pressed his ear to the ground. But the spiral did not show itself again until the girl. She arrived in the middle of the night, barefoot and mute, with ash covering her arms and neck. Her hair had been singed short, and her eyes were pure black, not from blindness, from memory. She didn't speak for 3 days. They tried food, warmth, song. Nothing broke her silence. Then Jan brought her a piece of charcoal and a wooden plank. She began to draw. Spirals, yes, cut, but also maps, symbols, eyes within eyes. And one shape that chilled Lucas to the core, the granary. She had never seen it, no one outside the village could have, but she drew it exactly. With the sack curtain, the hallway, the chamber, she had been there. Lucas sat beside her and asked, "Where did you come from?" She drew another symbol, a sun eclipsed. "What do you want?" She pointed to Jan. "No," Lucas said instinctively, but she just stared, calm, patient, not angry, not cruel, as if she already knew what was coming. Jan stood behind Lucas and said, "I'll go." "No," Lucas repeated, sharper. "You don't know what that place is." "I do," Jan said. "I've dreamed of it." That night, Sukas wept. Not out of fear or pain, but from the terrible knowledge that some things cannot be stopped, not by fire, not by forgetting. The spiral was not a place, nor a cult. It was a pattern of the world. A scar in time, tent, it would always return, drawn to those who remembered. And so Jan left. The girl led him. Lucas didn't follow. He only stood at the boundary and watched, the way his father had once watched his mother walk toward the coffin carts. The wind was gentle. The trees didn't whisper, "Be." The earth simply swallowed Jan, like it had done before with Beatrix, with the others. But Lucas did not spiral. He stood firm. He tended the village, raised crops, told stories. And when children asked about Jan, he told the truth not in full, but enough. That Jan had gone to understand something bigger than himself, that one day he might return, or not. And that life was made not only of staying, but of going. And as years passed, the village became a place not of fear, but of watchfulness, a place that did not forget. Lucas lived until his hair turned white and his hands curled from age. And when he died, they buried him beneath the old ash tree, with a carving of a spiral on his stone, not as a warning, but as a reminder that even in the darkest stories, there are those who choose to remember, those who choose to stay, those who carry the weight so others don't have to. The spiral remains, but so does hope. Time moved in peculiar ways after the plague. It no longer flowed like a river, predictably surging from season to season, but instead pulsed thick and uneven, like honey running cold in the comb. For the peasants of Branlow Hollow, time had once been measured in lamb births and barley threshing, but after the Black Death, it was counted differently in breaths taken after a coughing fit, in how many mornings passed without a burial, in how long a silence could hang in a room before someone dared speak of the past. By the final year of the second wave, the village had lost nearly 3/4 of its population. Entire households vanished without ceremony. Huts stood sealed by wooden planks painted with crude white crosses, as though wood and lime could contain the memory of death. The survivors didn't just bear grief, they wore it, like a second skin. Some bore it with grace, others with madness, and many with a numb silence that settled in their bones, deeper than the cold ever could. Thomas, once a farmhand of little note, had become the village's quiet patriarch. He never wanted the role, but the plague didn't ask permission before reshaping lives. He'd buried his wife and 2 daughters in the first year, and never remarried. He didn't speak much after that, not unless there was need. When he did, people listened. His words carried the weight of graves, and that made them holy. It was Thomas who organized the building of the second well, dug by hand after the first became choked with moss and rot. It was Thomas who split the remaining land into neat plots so that no family starved, and who walked from door to door during the late winter famine with a bag of grain over his shoulder, asking no coin in return. And it was Thomas who eventually began carving small crosses into the inside of his doorframe, not from superstition, but from memory, one for each soul gone. By the time he could no longer lift his carving knife, the wood bore 198 marks. But this final season, the world seemed to pause. A stillness had settled over Branlow Hollow. No new cases of fever, no smoke from funeral pyres, no traveling friars whispering of God's final wrath. For the first time in a decade, it felt as though the village might return to something like normal. Children, new ones, born after the worst had passed, played in the thawing fields. Elderly men, who once sat silent by the church steps, now hobbled out with tales again, warmed by the sun and by memory. Chickens returned to roost, cats slinked in the rafters, and rats, well, the rats never truly left. But there was one building none of them went near any more, the manor house, long abandoned. It loomed at the edge of the village like a corpse dressed in noble's clothing. Its shutters banged against the stone. With every gust of wind, ivy crept through the windows like fingers, desperate for warmth. The family that once lived there, the Demores, had fled when the first reports of pestilence reached them, leaving behind their servants, their debtors, and the sick. None returned, not even to claim their heirlooms, but something else did. Rumors spread among the children first. A light in the upper window, a silhouette by the broken chimney, whispers at night that didn't belong to anyone in the house. Most dismissed it as childish games, inventions born from old fear. But when Clara, the blacksmith's daughter, ran screaming from the manor one twilight, her eyes wide and glassy, Thomas went himself. He took no torch. Fire invited attention. Inside, he found decay and silence. Dust hung like gauze over every surface. A child's wooden doll sat face down in the foyer, its eyes burned out. A single raven nested in the rafters above the grand staircase. But Thomas Stand was not a man who frightened easily. He found the source of the rumors in the upper bedroom, the one that had once belonged to Lady Eleanor de Moray. There, slumped against the window, was a figure cloaked in rotting linens, unmoving, like a person, preserved in wax and sorrow. Thomas stepped forward slowly. The figure's hands were folded in its lap, bones visible through papery skin. Its face was obscured by hair, long and silver like cobwebs. He thought it a corpse, until its lips parted slightly. "You came late," it whispered, voice like wind through dead leaves. Thomas did not reply. "You all did," it continued, head turning just enough to reveal hollow eyes. "They said you'd save us, but you saved only yourselves." He realized then that this was no ghost, no demon, just Eleanor, still alive, or something close to it. Left behind, forgotten, perhaps too afraid to leave, or cursed to remain. It wasn't clear, and Thomas didn't ask. He only backed out of the room, leaving her with her silence, and barred the manor doors with nails and rope. When he returned to the village, he told no one what he'd seen. Let the past rot with its bones, he thought. But the dreams began again. That night. Old dreams. The ones of coughing fits and bleeding eyes, of children vanishing mid-life, of carts rumbling down cobblestone streets piled with the dead. Pet. This time, the dream ended with a voice, hers, Eleanor's, whispering, "We were all peasants, in the end." Spring came heavy and sudden that year. Trees bloomed faster than expected. Bees returned. The village survived. And slowly, people forgot the dreams, the manor, the plague. Fields were tilled again. Babies were born. Stories softened around the edges. It was bad, yes, people said, but we endured. And that became the legend, that Brandlow Hollow had endured, thanks to their own grit and the grace of God. But the real story was far more complicated. It was not one of endurance, but of trauma, of bargains made with silence, of grief too heavy to carry forward, and thus buried instead. For while the people survived, they did so by burying pieces of themselves, memories, names, guilt. Each family had their secrets. Each street corner held ghosts. The only man who remembered everything was Thomas. When he died at 74, they found under his bed a book. Leather-bound, pages torn in places, others soaked with ink or wine. A journal, not of crops or seasons but people. Of every face he had buried, every kindness he had witnessed, every fear he had tasted. It was written plainly, no flourishes, just the record of a life lived through plague. The final page bore only a single line, "Let them forget. I will remember for them." And perhaps that was the final gift of the peasant during the Black Death, not just to survive, but to carry the unbearable weight of memory so others could feel light again.